All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Sex Sales Podcast, the podcast where we talk about culture, relationships, and society from a male and a female perspective. No announcements again on this podcast. We're going to get straight into it. Today we're talking about head thinkers versus heart thinkers. So when you think of a head thinker, you're usually probably thinking of someone like me, people who like to analyze everything and try to be as rational as they possibly can, and can sometimes come across as robotic or mechanical and lacking empathy, but then at the same time can be very effective in, say, managerial positions, and often are the inventors of certain things, and can do very well in their professional life. And then we have heart thinkers. So these are people who are generally high in empathy. And that's not to say what I said before means they're excluded from performing really well in a professional or a corporate environment. These are people who connect really well with other people. They're very socially intelligent, emotionally intelligent. And yeah, you might think of Eliza. And I just read a book called The Essential Difference by Simon Baron-Cohen. I mentioned this, I think, 2 podcasts ago. And his main hypothesis was that the male brain is generally wired for systemizing, and that's probably a technical term for being a head thinker, and the female brain is generally wired for empathizing. And then he just sort of goes through that across the chapters. And you know what? It was a compelling read. I don't know if I'm entirely convinced. I think there's a lot of crossover and a lot of social influence that comes into play. But I wanted to do this podcast because I think there is a disconnect when someone who's, I suppose, high in head thinking communicates with someone who is high in heart thinking, or someone who's high in systemizing communicates with someone who's high in empathizing. And of course, it goes without saying, look, a lot of people say generally men tend to be more along the head thinking route, and vice versa. But there's, like I said, plenty of crossover. And if we're talking about a country like Australia where there's around 26 million people, there's likely millions who don't necessarily fit that description. So just a more formal definition of each. Empathizing is the drive to identify another person's emotions and thoughts and to respond to them with an appropriate emotion. Do you agree with that definition?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. And then for systemizing, they've got systemizing is the drive to analyze, explore, and construct a system. The systemizer intuitively figures out how things work or extracts the underlying rules that govern the behavior of a system. And even as succinct a description like that was so relatable. That's all I ever try to do all the time, is just try to find out the underlying rules. Now, I'm interested in topics that generally people who are higher in empathy would be interested in: the arts, creativity, human behavior, communication. But where I come at it with a point of difference is I'm constantly trying to understand the rules governing, say, human behavior or artistic prowess or whatever it may be. And there can be a disconnect when you're communicating with someone. I mean, in some of the early podcasts we did, there was some definitely more awkward moments.
Yeah.
But we seem to come to an understanding of how we can sort of move through that. And I think obviously it became a lot better as a result. And you're seeing this on a mass scale now where there's social media, even though we're in this world of we're more interconnected than ever, the social media bifurcation due to people just sort of interacting with other people who agree with them or have a likeness to them has, if anything, actually caused a greater rift between systemizers and empathizers. And you can even see this on different social media platforms. YouTube now seems to have become a source of just information. There's video essays everywhere, and it does seem to be a predominantly male audience on that platform. And TikTok is very different. There's the best TikToks are the ones where you can see someone's face directly, and they actually recommend that. And it's, in my best estimation, a point of social connection that you can generate when you see someone's face and you're making eye contact with them there. and there often can be confusion and conflict between head thinkers and heart thinkers, where heart thinkers can often think head thinkers come across as very cold, callous, unloving, lacking empathy, and similarly, head thinkers can construe a lot of the communication of heart thinkers as childish, self-absorbed, unnecessary, or sometimes even narcissistic. And what I think is actually lacking is not necessarily empathy, but an understanding of how each other's brains operate.
Yeah.
So if someone actually their brain is wired differently, and in that they can't experience empathy to the same effect as someone else, how much can you shame them? How much can we sort of judge them for maybe not empathizing on whether it's a political issue or a personal issue, an interpersonal relationship issue, something like that? I was thinking about this the other day. Maybe the best way to describe it could be like, empathy is obviously a skill. It's something you can get better at, you can work on and better understand other people's emotions and their motivations and where they may be coming from. But I think some people may be genetically predisposed to harnessing that skill and having a better capacity for that skill, in the same way some people can do physical work and get strong and improve their physical strength. But there are some people who just genetically are always going to be stronger than others, regardless of how much each other, lift weights or, do physical work or whatever. Like I'm probably someone like that. I could work out as much as I want, but, there'd be other men out there who might just be born with a just far more pronounced genetic window of how strong they're capable of becoming, and they could be training, 10% as much as I myself, but they're always going to be stronger. And the point I'm trying to make is that I don't think the skill of empathizing is entirely socially malleable, and there are some people who just cannot empathize to the same degree as other people.
Yeah, 100%. And how many times you wouldn't believe how many women have said to me, I think my boyfriend's autistic.
Well, that's the other thing. Yeah. Then there's the...
like so many. It's crazy. And I'm like, maybe he is, but I don't think every second man is autistic, which a lot of people just seem to think is what's happening, because they associate the not having the same degree of empathy and softness as autism, or a lack of understanding of someone's emotions. So it is a really interesting concept, and I actually did a course on this years ago, where I flew to Melbourne, and it was called it was part of my life coaching course, and it's called Multiple Brain Integration Techniques, or MBIT. And it was one of those things where it was part of a 2-year course I was doing, and I didn't actually want to do this one because it seemed really focused. It was a bit too hippie for me, or so it seemed. And
if it's too hippie for you, that's saying something.
I know. And the purpose of it is, it was like, it's supposed to be ways to integrate your heart, your head, and in this one, your gut brain. So they would say the 3 brains that you need to integrate to become more of like decision-making, holistic, blah, 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 blah. And I was like, oh, this is going to be boring. I don't want to do it. And I like the whole like connect with your heart kind of like, for me, it was too hippie. But what was really fascinating is the way that the therapy works is you're put into a state of a combination of basically meditation and hypnosis. However, you're getting prompted with specific questions, and then what answers that you come out with are a reflection of your subconscious. And this is what I found really fascinating, because through this course I discovered, I didn't discover it, but I obviously confirmed I was heavily a heart thinker, and a lot of my decisions and beliefs, everything comes from my heart. And even just one way of telling is a heart thinker often has their hands right in front of their chest, or chots their chest a lot, which I always do. And this therapy is in the state of meditation hypnosis. You go in and you talk to or check in and feel and connect with your heart center, your brain center, and your gut center, right? And I had the practitioner practice it on me, they were like, think of something that you feel conflicted about, torn about, a decision you need to make, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, I have nothing. I was drawing up blanks. I was like, everything's cruisy for me. I don't have a decision or a conflict or anything to even do this with. I can't make one up. I don't know what to do. The only thing I could think of last minute is I had broken up with my boyfriend like a year ago, and he'd moved back to Canada, and then he had told me, I'm still in love with you, I'm coming back to Australia to be with you. And we were like, that was like one of those passionate toxic loves, and I was so excited for him to come back. I was like, this means everything. And when I went to do this course, he was a week from coming back home to me, and I was beside myself with excitement. Anyway, so I was like, this is the only thing going on in my life, so I'll do this. And what I found fascinating is I went into the state of meditation quite quickly, and they were asking me questions, and it took me like, I was cringed for like 2 seconds when they were like, check in with your heart thing. But then I was answering things and saying things in each, like when I spoke from my heart, which is what they do first, even it sounds cringe even explaining it, but when I spoke from my heart, I was speaking how I would speak now. I had the same thoughts. I was really excited, blah, blah, blah. Then when I went in subconsciously accessing or embracing my heart, my head brain, or my gut brain, I had completely different responses coming out of my mouth that I was shocking myself with as I was saying them, that I wasn't even consciously connected to. I hadn't even thought these things before. And then I was like, did I just make this up for the sake of this practice? I'm so like confused, because when I went to my head, I was saying logistically, this relationship isn't going to work out. This is what's going to happen. This isn't healthy. And I came out of it feeling like really disoriented. And anyway, what ended up happening was every single thing that my head brain was telling me ended up being 100% true and coming true. So this is like kind of irrelevant. Even though it worked for me and it worked for everyone there, it's still like a very like hippy dippy practice. But my point is that people that were led by their head or led by their heart or led by their gut had completely different approaches to life and decision making and what they thought was important or how they approached conflict resolution, etc. And one thing I've learned throughout the duration of my study, etc., I'm really actually interested in head thinkers and heart thinkers. I'm excited that we're doing this today because I've had to adapt to when I communicate with someone, I always observe whether they're a heart thinker and whether they're a head thinker. And once I've got that down packed, I communicate with them in a way that it's gonna be more impactful for them. So in some ways it might not seem genuine because it might be like, well, I'm not speaking my truth from my heart or whatever, but I am, but in a way that they are going to understand it better. So like a really like cliche example would be, say I'm a heart thinker and Adrian's a head thinker, and I'm saying, I feel sad when you do XYZ. Instead, I might change that. And in me saying I feel sad, or it makes me feel so shitty when you do this, or it makes me angry, me saying that is trying to get them to elicit an emotional response like guilt, shame, or empathy for me in order to change that behavior. And this is what a lot of women fall into this trap, where they're trying to communicate something with their partner and they're trying to elicit that emotional response so that they change, because that's how we would typically change our behavior when we feel bad about something, so we would change it. But instead, what I learned and practice is, if they are a heart thinker, I would say, like, in order for our relationship to be a more safe or loving relationship, this is what I need for you, and this is why I need it, and like providing the literal reasoning behind it. And it was 1,000 times more effective than me subconsciously trying to make them feel bad to change their behavior. I presented the facts to them, the evidence, and the incentive for why this behavior or whatever needs to be changed in a way that is better understood and interpreted by them and taken on board by them, even though the message is still the same. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And so simple yet so effective. And I think the
Yeah.
world would benefit from that sort of insight, because what you tend to see on social media and even in traditional media is a conflict between people who are head thinkers and heart thinkers. And there are a lot of intellectual shows where they'll have two people butt heads and someone is making an emotional point, the other person is arguing with them from a rational point of view, and it just doesn't work. That rational point of view will appeal to a certain amount of people. The emotional point of view will appeal to a certain amount of people, and they'll both not understand each other, and it's a terrible way in which we can fall into a trap of not communicating effectively. And I strive to do what you do as well, and I think naturally I'm more inclined to be a head thinker, but
Yeah.
if I'm communicating with someone who comes across as more of a heart thinker, I'll definitely soften my language and not necessarily be as direct, and not even use the sort of language I may use with a head thinker. And it will be more about connecting with them on an emotional level rather than discussing various ideas with them. And you see a lot about, say, the devil's advocate on TikTok. There's this trend where, debating and playing devil's advocate is just a sign of a toxic man and things like that. But a head thinker doesn't see it that way. The head thinker is actually, I would even argue, devil's advocate on a contentious issue is actually a way to empathize with people who have that different point of view. Because what you're trying to do is understand how they got to that perspective and point of view. And you do that by adopting their position and trying to argue from their perspective. And I think that's where people misconstrue that, where they think, oh, you're just being an edgelord and trying to upset me for the sake of it. When maybe there are some, what they call debate bros who just want to be argumentative for the sake of it. But I know when I'm trying to say, if I'm discussing something with my partner or a friend, and I'm the first person to say, if they've made a point, I'll say, okay, well, so maybe I'll say something like, some people would say this, or I don't directly say to play devil's advocate anymore, because I know that's just certain stereotypes that people often conjure up. But I'll say, okay, a lot of people might think this. What do you think of that? And I'm not, how that can come across to a lot of heart thinkers, at least from my experience, is that you're just being unnecessarily combative and you're not engaging with the emotional reality of the situation right there. And people can think of you as just, like I said, cold, callous, lacking empathy. But I just, I would encourage anyone who might be a heart thinker to see it from that other perspective. But at the same time, there's also a sense of emotional decorum that head thinkers might need to learn and practice. And isn't this so interesting? Because heart thinkers might be more influenced by the most powerful emotional anecdote in changing their mind about something. So if we're talking about a political issue or just an issue in an organization, and someone can express themselves in an emotional way that tugs at the heartstrings, a heart thinker might be convinced by that. Yeah. Whereas a head thinker needs to see trends, or needs to see some sort of evidence, or needs to see, I guess, more collective means of ascertaining what the appropriate position could be. And then you see that with a lot of, say, social justice rhetoric, where on certain shows in Australia, Q&A is a prime example. They'll bring on someone who has a really heartfelt story of how maybe they've experienced racism, or maybe they have endured some sort of hardship, and it clearly tugs at people's heartstrings, and they connect with that emotionally, and it often will go viral, and it will convince people of a certain position on a particular issue. Whereas, to me, it's not like I don't connect with those emotions. I absolutely can empathize with someone like that. But what I can't do is take that next step into a conclusion about the world at large, because what someone may have personally experienced does not give me enough insight to make a conclusion about the world at large. And, that's caused a lot of conflict in maybe other relationships I've had. But I suppose that's where I'm coming from there. I'm if anything, it's a wariness of manipulation, maybe, because if you're simply if you're not led by emotions at all, it creates just a cold person who just struggles to connect with people. But sometimes if you're, say, an empath, which I don't know if that's a real thing, but people who are just highly empathetic, you can be very easily manipulated, because then someone who is just the most effective at toying with your emotions can convince you of something and convince you that they are in need the most, when they may not be in need the most, but they're just the most effective at communicating things emotionally. So it's this whole quandary of different perspectives of communication that seem to be really prevalent right now. And the last thing I'll say is that I couldn't help but think, okay, what is a huge thing that young boys are doing now? They're playing video games, and that's teaching them to systemize. They're not interacting with people socially on a face-to-face level. They're thinking about the rules of a system and how to beat the next level and achieve, the goal, and that's how they attain status. And that's sort of seeping into their subconscious, even though they know, all right, this isn't real. And a lot of young girls are spending a lot of time on social media, having to traverse the world of cyberbullying, of name calling, of shaming, of physical insecurities, and this could be exacerbating their already potentially biological urges to be empathetic. And similarly with boys, it could be just exacerbating their predisposition to be a systemizer, and maybe that could be where you see a further separation between the sexes, or people who played a lot of video games in their youth compared to people who spend most of their time on other forms of social media in their youth, because they've in that formative period of adolescence, they've changed their brain chemistry and further become a systemizer or an empathizer. And I can't see how that's healthy if there's just these two groups of people that can't communicate with each other.
Yeah, it's so funny. I was just thinking about how I went through this stage of being obsessed recently, like in the last few years on and off, with this video game Ark, where you tame dinosaurs and fight and build, like you survive basically where dinosaurs exist. And I played with Adrian, and Adrian always wanted to go out and hunt shit and fight with other clans. And I was so attached to these dinosaurs. I just didn't want to do anything. I just wanted to feed them, keep them in their little home, and just have them there and adopt all the ones I could find. It was, it's funny, different type of approach that he and I had to that. But I think a really good example as well is I was drawn to veganism at a young age because of feeling empathetic for animals. When I watched a video of what pigs went through, blah, 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 traumatized. So I went vegan. It was as simple as that. And it's easy for me to stay vegan because I just have to think about it for a millisecond. And then I'm reinforced in my beliefs. But with a lot of people, they can see a pig get slaughtered and be like, that's the circle of life. That's nature. This is the food chain. And that's not distressing to them at all. And there's this YouTuber, TikTok or whatever, he's super influential in the vegan sphere, called Earthling Ed. And he debates with people about veganism, and he can basically win any argument, and he on pure logic. He doesn't talk about the animals suffer. He doesn't talk about this. He talks about the impact on the environment. He talks about deforestation. He talks about carcinogenic and health and all these things. And he literally can fight with or debate with anyone just based on facts. And he has every single study, every single research, every single stat off the top of his head ready to go. And it's amazing how his approach is so impactful when he communicates and debates with men, because they're oh shit, yeah, okay, yeah, fair enough. So it's really interesting in that way. And when we talked about, when you mentioned like heart people are more likely to be prone to being manipulated, taken advantage of, it's 100% true. And for me, even I feel like I have a very good read and understanding of people, and I don't allow myself to get manipulated ever. I've got really strong boundaries, and I know when people are lying to me or using me, blah, blah, blah. But I literally think so highly of everyone I meet, and I just genuinely basically like every single person I've ever met. So when I know that those things are happening or I'm prone to that person doing that to me, it almost doesn't impact me because I'll still think highly of them, or I'll be like, well, this happened kind of thing. And my friend and I were talking about this the other day, how she's like a forgive and never forget type of person. And I'm a forgive and immediately forget type of person, just let it go as soon as they say like sorry or apologize to me, which has its pros and it has its cons, obviously, like massive cons. And we talked like, we've mentioned a couple of things about the downside of heart thinkers. And I think that even though we mentioned that head thinkers can come across as cold or callous or whatever, I think one big detriment to a head thinker is the lack of, in their communication, the lack of validation to someone when they're talking about how they're feeling. Or just like an example off the top of my head, my friend was talking to her partner, a male, about how women are, basically all women have experienced sexual harassment, sexual assault, violence, these kind of things. And he was like, and she was talking about her personal experience with it. And he was like, yeah, I know that that's like everyone, you've gone through that and everyone, that, but maybe that's just like your circle of friends. And he wouldn't take her at her word for it until she had to get up data, research, stats, documentaries to talk about the lived experience from a woman, because he wouldn't take the word of a lived experience from a woman, if that makes sense. And I said, well, there's pros and cons to that, because now he's educated and now he understands, and he can't, like, he was afterwards, there was no rebuttal. He was like, wow, fuck. But she was like, when I talk about things that are personal, he invalidates it unless I can provide the literal evidence for it, and it drives me insane. So I think, there's definitely, obviously there's pros and cons to everything. And then there's a third party, which are gut people, and people that go purely by their gut instinct on things. And that can be impacted drastically by your childhood and your trauma. If you have trauma in your childhood, you are much less likely to trust people. You might find them untrustworthy. And when I put this poll up the other day on my Instagram about icks, and saying like, what is your ick? And I had so many stupid responses, that were really funny, of what people find as icks. Like someone put, when you take a deep breath before going underwater, stuff like that. But a lot of men kept replying saying like, women that use icks as a reason to not commit in a relationship. And that's actually a really, really valid point. And that would come from, and sometimes it would come from your trauma making you feel that adults or people cannot be trusted, or your experiences or previous relationships. So you're subconsciously finding reasons to be turned off or disgusted by someone. But then the pro of gut people is that their gut instinct can be so on point that they don't have to find the logical understanding of it. There is something beneath, even further than the rational logic, that is intrinsic in their body, subconsciously pushing a message out, and they just go by it and trust it, and it's so often it's right. And one of my best friends is a gut girl, the gut, definitely led by her gut. And there's been so many times where like I'd go on a date with a guy because we lived together, and he'd come home and she'd be like, I don't have a good feeling. Absolutely not. And I'd be like, what? He's funny. What do you mean? And every single time she was right. My gut instinct was always so off, and hers was always so on point. And then my third friend, who was a head thinker, she'd be like, well, is he nice to you? And does he do this? And does he have a job? And like, that's how she's analyzing whether or not it is a suitable candidate. And I was going off, well, I find him funny and affectionate and it makes me feel good. So I'm going to keep dating him, which is a funny little like anecdotal thing about how the different interpretations and what we value as well can be different amongst head thinkers and heart thinkers. You might value different things. But yeah, it is really interesting. And I think that it's really essential that we not only just learn to communicate effectively with, other heart or first head people, but also understand them better, or understand, can you integrate more of that within yourself? Like, I've had to practice so hard over the years to become more of a logical thinker and more of a head thinker. And I would say that when I used to be 100% heart, I'm probably like 70-30 now, but I'm pretty happy with that balance where I've really had to integrate more head thinking into my life and making decisions based on that. And I was looking up stats on this earlier to see, like, are there any stats present about heart and head thinkers? And there were, surprisingly, although this survey or this research was done with only like 1,000 people, so it's not like the biggest sample, but it was done by the Medical Alert Buyer's Guide, and they were polled about their head and heart decisions. And it said that 79% of people said that they were head people and 21% said they were heart people. And 68% of people agreed that following one's heart when making business decisions cloud judgment. 64% believe that following one's head over heart is pivotal to success. Those that follow their heads have an average salary that is 13% higher than those that follow their hearts. 16% of people changed careers because they regretted following their heart, while 15% did because of their head. And then one last one, though, was of the 1,011 people that were surveyed, 60% of those who followed their heart said they're more satisfied with their current job compared to 50% that went through their head. So there was a little bit interesting. And also, under time pressure, people are more likely to make risky decisions when they're feeling happy and when they're feeling sad. That was interesting. Yeah.
They're very interesting, and they're also self-reported though, because I think there's this stereotype of a certain group of people who think, I'm a logical thinker and I don't make emotional decisions. It's just not true. We're all on some sort of scale, and emotions dictate your rationality more than you realize. There's a great book by... Well, Jonathan Haidt talks about this a lot, but he was also quoting another book where they use an elephant and a rider, and then they're not sure whether it's a sort of metaphor as to whether the little person at the top, which sort of symbolizes the brain, is controlling the elephant, or is it that the elephant just sort of goes where it wants, and then that person in a split second is sort of following them and thinking they're the one in charge. And we don't really know. It's likely an interplay between both. And some people just seem to be able to either suppress the heart thinking or are just not as in touch with it, and vice versa. I know my strategy seems and not so much a conscious strategy, but how I've come about to treat this is that on a one-on-one level in any kind of interpersonal relationships, I lead with my heart. I'm very empathetic, and I really want to validate everyone and make sure they're in, because that's what I think you need in a one-on-one, in a partnership. As you just broaden the involvement of people in whatever the organization might be or whatever the circumstance may be, whether this is conscious or not, I just naturally move towards more systemizing. So it's not a large company by any means, but I'm now sort of managing a few people and a few shows. ComedyUntamed.com, come along. And I have to be a head thinker there, because if I am a heart thinker, There are people who have different ideas and they're very passionate about those ideas, but they may conflict with someone else. And I have to just sort of, in a way, invalidate someone's ideas or, support it to a degree, but still push back on it and go with someone else's. And I just can't see how you can, as a system gets larger, I can't see how it's one of those things where you need a basic level of empathy, but then the ability to systemize then comes into it. But then what you have is these tech billionaires who are just seemingly extraordinarily high systemizers and just lacking any kind of empathy at all. Just from podcasts, you look at Mark Zuckerberg, you're like, this guy has never felt an emotion in his life. It could just be the way he presents. I don't know. And so that's, I guess, how I see it. But then when we're talking about ideas in the abstract, so particularly if we're talking about politics or even just culture, religion, economics, things like that, that's when I'm totally a head thinker. I can't even, because, if you're having an argument between, I don't know, like communism and capitalism, like I don't even know where the heart could go in something like that. It's a totally abstract discussion there. But what does happen, and coming back to the validation thing, I think it's super important that people who are more inclined to be head thinkers can learn that skill of emotional validation for other people. But for just in personal instances, I've found that by validating someone, you can't, sometimes you may actually disagree with their version of events, or you may not agree with their conclusions. So a totally extreme example would be someone like, okay, they cheated on a partner and they were, the poor moral actor in a situation. They ghosted them, they cheated on them, let's just say they've done all these things. And then they come to you really upset. Well, what do you want to validate that they're a close friend of yours, you want to validate their emotions, you want to say, hey, look, I can understand that you're upset, you've lost someone that you love and I'm here for you, and it's an issue of timing more than anything. But at the same time, if they're then saying I gave them everything and I did all these things, and in your mind you're like, well, you did. I don't think you acted morally in this situation. I don't agree with your conclusions. I can connect with your emotions and validate them, but I can't agree with the conclusions you're making from those emotions. And that's where you get into really treacherous territory. And that's where I think a lot of conflicts come up, because someone will be in an emotional state, and you doing everything you can to validate them, but they might be saying something like, "Oh, and this is why this company is garbage." And I can't think of a specific ideal example for this, but basically they're making conclusions about maybe other people or an organization or even the world. And you may not agree with that. You may think, well, actually, no, I think the boss did the right thing in firing you. But, you obviously can't necessarily say that. And to me, that is a minefield. And I wonder if you have any thoughts on those specific situations where you want to validate their emotions, but you don't want to validate the conclusions or the narrative that they've developed from those emotions.
Well, one thing I will say is that in the situation of like people that have cheated in that scenario, say, if I were approached and someone was talking about that to me, me as a heart thinker, my empathy goes immediately to the person that was betrayed. And so I might actually not be validating my friend or whatever, because I might even be like, well, this is not a friendship I want to sustain. I probably wouldn't do that. This is just, worst case scenario. I might be like, I don't want to be around someone like you because of what you've done to your partner. Like my heart might be projected to them rather than the person that's approached me. That makes sense.
Yeah, but what if they're really in a state of distress? What if, say, someone has, cause I know you've dealt with troubled children and things that they've committed a crime, but then they're crying and they're just in one of those heightened states of distress where, I don't know, maybe I am an empath, but I can't, you want to hug someone when they're like that, even if they've just beaten someone up or something like that. It's a what would you do there?
That's happened to me many times where a child has committed crime and then come to me. And now that you put it in that way, I 100% am there to hold the space for them. And I will try to calm them down by not saying it's okay, like mistakes happen. I'll be like, you know what, John, like you fucked up big time and we're going to put the pieces together. We're going to figure it out. This is how we're going to start it. Like, let's get some sleep tonight. Let's get some food in you. And then I'm going to come back in the morning and we're going to work through this. I'm going to call your psychologist. I'm going to do this. I'm going to call your school. Like, here's the action plan. And that in itself is a way of offering empathy that it takes some of the burden off them that, okay, someone is looking after me. Someone is going to hold me in this place. Someone is going to support me through this. And there's an action plan towards it whilst not validating the crime or actions that they've committed as such. So and it is hard because there have 100% been times in my youth, like when I was working younger at like 20, with teens where I wanted to validate them for literally anything they did. But I found that challenging someone gently is so essential to growth and putting responsibility on them as well. Like the kids and families I work with, almost all of them have a lot of trauma, and a lot of these behaviors and actions or crimes that they commit may stem from trauma. But I can't allow and empathize with someone where which has happened, sexually assaulted a young girl because of their trauma. I can understand why it happened, but I can't be like, that's okay, you had this happened to you and your parents abandoned. No, like it's about, okay, we've got to go have this interview with the police. We've got to do this. I'll be here every single day working on this with you. So yeah, that combination of it's tough love almost, like it's assertive, firm support, but it's not justification. And it is, I will always try to ensure that young person or that individual is taking responsibility. And a really good example of this, I don't know if you've watched this, but I've been watching Ultimatum Queer Love on Netflix. And I think I spoke about this on our last podcast where it's like they have to decide are they going to get married or are they going to split up, and so they date other partners. And there's this one couple where it's their name, there's Ozzy and the wife is called Sam. And Ozzy, who is, they're in a lesbian relationship. Ozzy is like so frustrating to watch the entire show because they keep every single time their trial wife or partner says, I'm really struggling with something, I want to communicate with you, Ozzy is like, don't blame me, and then leaves and walks out before the conversation has even started. And I was like, oh my God, can this person just not run away and sit and have a conversation for once? And I was getting myself so like frustrated at them. And then in one of the more like recent episodes, Ozzy has like this huge meltdown, screaming, crying on the side of the road, being like, as a child, I was blamed for everything. This is why I can't communicate, because I cannot feel like I'm to blame. I can't deal with conflict. And they're crying, they're like screaming, and I just felt so much empathy for not only that they had, experienced that in their childhood and understanding why they're like that, but the fact that they were having it's one of the biggest meltdowns I've ever seen, like being filmed on TV, and they're not like reality TV stars. They've been there for 3 weeks. And the fact that was filmed for all of their co-workers to see, their family to see in such a vulnerable state, made me just so full of love and empathy for them. I was like, oh God, I wish I was there just to pick them up, take them away and look after them. And then anyway, the next episode comes around and then Ozzy's getting up and walking away from their partner and I'm pissed off at them again. But it is funny how like it fluctuates. But I think a really good example of kind of what you're talking about before, like in your job and the way that you have to approach your employees in social work, and in my previous organization, almost everyone was like a heart thinker, because no one would be doing the work, doing this level of stress and trauma and subjecting themselves to that and abuse if they weren't heart thinkers and they weren't led by their heart. And everyone has been abused in that industry, whether it be verbally at least or physically, like me many a time. But when, as well as working and doing those things with the clients, a big part of it in on the organizational aspect is we would have to do on average maybe at least 100 pages of report writing a week. And if you literally just think about how many pages 100 pages is, it is so much report writing. And all the time my staff were pushing back to me, and then I'd be pushing up to the CEO being like, this is completely unmanageable. It's way too much work on top of seeing clients, working with families to write this many pages. If we went and saw a client in their home, the report that comes afterwards is 12 pages just to visit a client. Even if you're there for 20 minutes, it's 12 pages. It's crazy. And you have to meet every single criteria and answer to every single thing. And if there's not enough information in it, me as like the team leader would have to send it back and be like, I need you to fill this out more. And that was my role, which is really hard. And so we'd always be pushing back, and I was always torn between the two, being a team leader, organization versus team needs. And basically the first approach they took, they had this meeting where they were like, this is the law and legislation of child protection and children's protective rights, their act, blah, blah, blah. You're obligated to complete this information. And if you're employed here, this is what you have to do. If you want to remain employed here and you want to be working this job and you want to be earning this salary, which is above most in like this field, then this is the responsibility you have to take on. And then everyone was furious at that, like completely invalidated. So then a few weeks later, we went back and I did a workshop about how the reports that we write is the story that the child will receive when they become an adult and when they're 18, and that they're going to have a lot of clouded information. They're going to have a lot of judgment. They're going to have a lot of potentially shame, sense of abandonment, and our words and the way that we write about the children is going to fill those gaps for them, to see that what support was provided for them, what their interests were in that time. You know, it feels silly to talk and spend a page writing about what their favorite toy is or who their friend is and what they played with on the weekend, but that is going to be the child's memory. And it was amazing, like within days, everyone was back on board with writing all this paperwork and doing all these things because it had pulled at their heartstrings, being like, this isn't for the organization, this isn't for law and legislation, this is for the children. So it's funny how like with different agencies or organizations, and when like Adrian, he's a site manager and he's a tradie, and he was talking about how like one of his employees is like really like kind of dragging their feet, not loving everything, feeling a bit like invalidated because the work's hard. And instead of Adrian being like, yeah, I know it's hard, man, he's like, this is a fucking job, man. Like, do your job or don't do it. Like, I don't care. Just make up your mind. If you're going to be in this position, you got to do this job. Like, completely just facts, logic, and that's what works for them, but very different for what works in like an organization like health and social work. And think about like nurses and teachers as well, like how much of time, especially nurses, have to go through and put into, and what they endure and are subjected to is so crazy and so much. And they wouldn't do that being like, well, logically, this, you know, will earn me a really good living and a life. No, they're doing it out of like, in most cases, passion and empathy. So, yeah, it's
absolutely
interesting.
People need a compelling emotional narrative to accompany their oftentimes suffering. And
well said, yeah.
You see this in, say, with some of the new figures that have been appealing to young men. You think, well, why is this person in particular resonated with so many people? Because it's not like he's saying anything really new or unique. But I think a large part of it is also the validation I think some men feel when they hear, say, a Jordan Peterson saying, you know, like, this is how the modern world is telling you to be nihilistic, and, you know, this is where you might have experienced certain emotions, and this is why you should take responsibility and you know, do X, Y, Z, or I mean, even I found it surprising, but I went onto this forum where there are a lot of people who were fans of Andrew Tate, and they were saying things like, "Oh, he helped me change my life. He helped me turn my life around." And I thought, well, look, there's so many male speakers out there that are talking about responsibility and building a business and all these sorts of things. What was it about him specifically? Because it's accompanied with quite a toxic narrative. And the best conclusion I could come to was, okay, a lot of these guys may have had bad experiences with women, and maybe that's from their mother, or they are actually beholden to these ideas that we now see as archaic, and they felt emotionally validated with his expression of that common experience. And then when he said, now this is how you can also better yourself, that's what resonated with them. And so, self-help never really worked with me. I thought it was a bit cliche and cringeworthy. But then when Jordan Peterson talks about self-help concepts, but he sort of accompanies it with a more of an intellectual narrative, and that really resonated with me. And that was something that, as more of a head thinker, but still definitely with a heart component, it ticked both boxes. And that's the best explanation I could come up with when, I thought, there's so many motivational gurus and people talking about these things. What was it about that specific person?
Yeah.
And that point of validation is so important. Every human being, I don't think it's just a hard thinkers thing. I think hard thinkers maybe have more of a need for it, but everyone needs to feel like their experiences
Are seen.
are being
and valid.
validated, and then also their ideas. Maybe with a head thinker, it's more their ideas as well. And that doesn't mean you have to agree hands down, but if you can acknowledge that they've come to a certain conclusion, and then, like you said, with someone who you might feel has done the wrong thing, a light challenge, a sort of respectful challenge or something like that with someone who might have come to some conclusion using their head. And then the other point of conflict I thought of when you were talking earlier, there was when people have conflicting narratives, because it can completely change the reality of a situation. And how many court cases are people saying, I did this, but that's because you did X, Y, Z. Yeah, but I'm the one who's hard done by. No, I'm the one who's hard done by. And there's no actual objective truth there. It's just both parties engaged in some sort of behavior that they felt was justified. And, one said some horrible verbal things to someone on the street. This is bloke one, and then bloke two thought it was justification to punch them. And so you think, well, who's in the right here? Like, who do we actually validate more than the other? And whose version of events do we validate the most there? And yeah, I know I keep coming back to that, but it's something I find really, at times, frustrating, but also interesting, how we're almost designed to come up with our own narratives about the world. Like I listened to this podcast the other day, one of the Sam Harris ones, and it was a neuroscientist talking about how we don't actually see the world as it is. Our eyes are not a perfect camera. What we do is we have a simulation of the world, and then our eyes basically just map that simulation onto the world. Yeah. And that is so fascinating, because the implications of that are we're not actually seeing reality as it is. We're seeing reality in a way that is self-serving. And I think we have an emotional view of this sometimes, not always, but we can have an emotional view of this, where if we've experienced a traumatic breakup, rather than our subconscious acknowledging that we're just this imperfect person, or sometimes even a person who wasn't worthy of the other person's love, we construct a narrative that gives us a little bit of peace and contentment in that moment, which says, okay, either I've been completely hard done by, or, it was 50-50 as to, we both did some bad things and it was just a messy relationship or something like that. And I think that's actually advantageous, even from like a basic evolutionary point of view, because humans are obviously extraordinarily social beings, and if we can always be looking to not never take accountability per se, but thinking about ways in which, well, developing narratives of the world and the people around us that are self-serving, there's an obvious evolutionary advantage to that. We can probably climb more social hierarchies that way, and maybe even attract more mates. Who knows? But then if it's not done well, it gets found out very easily, and that's your not classic case of narcissism or something like that. But I just, I know I'm rambling a bit here, but I just find that just the phenomenon of different narratives and those conflicting narratives to be so interesting, but also so intrinsic to the human condition. I mean, how many wars have been started because one country is like, oh, you're being unfair to us, and the other country is like, no, you're actually being unfair to us. All right, let's go kill each other. It's, yeah, it's just, it's extremely interesting, and I wonder if society needs all those energies. It needs a certain energy of head thinkers in there, and it needs a certain amount of heart thinkers in there. Within each person, you need to be able to integrate both of those facets into your identity. Maybe in a tribe of 50 to 100 people, that tribe was naturally inclined to find those energies some way, shape, or form. So maybe if there was a group of males there that were all too far onto the head thinking side of things, there were maybe a few other males that came out, and then just as a natural force, almost as this like uniform
balance,
rule of human society, they just were attracted to more heart thinking perspectives of the world, and you can almost see that in the pendulum swing of culture, can't you? Because say there's the hippie movement, and then after that there's a much more rigid or ordered movement of neoliberalism, and then there's this constant the social justice kind of thing, and then this thing, and it's just this constant back and forth pendulum swing, yin and yang, of the energies of humanity. And I think
nature
one
wanting
last
to bring everything in balance.
Yeah, it could be nature. Yeah. Nature and as hippie as it may sound, the universe trying to balance everything out. And I think if you're open to the fact that you could be wrong, that's a really powerful thing, because then you don't if people are going to challenge you or something, as long as it's done in a respectful way, you're then immune to your narratives becoming completely self-absorbed. Because there's times in my life where I didn't want to engage in people's constructive criticism, and that sort of hurt me in the long run. So now I like to think I'm very open to criticism, so long as it's constructive and delivered in a respectful way. But yeah.
So what's Andrea? Is she a heart thinker or a head thinker?
I think she's a bit of both. I don't know. I don't think she's either way. She's very empathetic. So maybe more heart, but I don't think it's a binary. I think everyone has a bit of both, and then depending on your experiences, you could probably, there's a socially influenced element to that, without a doubt. But
and also, totally forgot to mention as well, like neurodivergency, which may lead you to be completely on one end of the spectrum where you're not understanding specific mechanisms or emotions or responses, and you need to know what makes sense and use pure logic to understand, okay, this person may be upset because of this, rather than, reading expressions. Or on the other side, like, so a lot of women with autism have extreme levels of empathy, like highly, highly empathetic. And a lot of women with autism I know are vegan, passionate about animals, social justice, extremely, extremely on this end of the other end of the spectrum, leaning by heart. So I think that's another like completely new aspect as well is neurodivergency. Might put like the real extreme ends of those spectrums where it can be make it not always possible for everyone to find that balance and or learn that balance. It might not be within everyone's reach to be like, I can balance these two out and integrate them as well. So it's about like, how does this impact your life? Is it negatively impacting your life? Do you need to learn with more proper way, like strategies in order to integrate that? And do you understand if that needs to be integrated as well, like for anyone, not just neurodivergent people as well? But it's also one of those concepts. It's like not many people are going to think deeply about that. Not many people are going to, in their self-reflections, be like, I'm too much of a heart person. I should be a head person. This is what I'm going to do. Or vice versa. I feel like that's not something that's often on the forefront of people's mind, and maybe it should be, or maybe it's not that deep. Like it's interesting. It could be either way, and it's like, well, is it head versus heart, or is it nature versus nurture? Is it personality? Is it neurodivergency or neurotypicalness? Like there's so many elements to it that which make it really like interesting and fascinating. And I was watching this video just before, and it kind of like almost says, not so much says the opposite, but like a little bit to the left of what that book you read said, that which was, women are more led by empathy and men are more systematic. And this video I was watching was saying that women are all about outcomes, and this is just, I don't know if this is backed by anything, and men are all about intention. So men might say, well, yeah, this happened, but I didn't intend for that. I didn't intend to hurt your feelings. I didn't intend to do this. Like it counts for everything to say like this was my intention. And women are like, I don't care about if you intended to or not. That doesn't mean shit. You did this, like you completed this action or whatever, or this is the outcome for this. Now I'm pissed off. Now I'm betrayed. Now I'm upset, which is an interesting kind of conflict to that, because you'd feel like intention leans more towards empathy and outcome leans more towards systems.
Yeah.
Just an interesting food for thought.
It's interesting, and that's that. I can
Does that
definitely
make sense
relate
to me?
to that. Yeah, I
Yeah,
can relate to
yeah.
that because, and there's a tension there because sometimes you may not have the intention to physically hurt someone, but your actions might have done that. You could have been drunk or something like that, and
Yeah.
you still need to be obviously held accountable. When it comes to words, that's where you get into the gray area. And yeah, people have it can lead to really intense points of conflict where someone is hell bent on getting across that their intention wasn't to upset someone, and the other person is just feeling invalidated because their experience of being upset is not being acknowledged, and
Yeah.
it can just cause end of the world fights in relationships. And I don't even think this is just an interpersonal phenomenon. I think so much of this can be related to the current discourse on politics and culture. And the other thing is that people who are heart thinkers and lead with empathy are usually more incentivized to talk about their experiences of pain and
Yeah.
hardship. And so you might get a skewed view of what people who are head thinkers actually endure. And that's something head thinkers need to think about. Even if you systemize it, you think, well, okay, there's a certain portion of the population that interpret things far more emotionally. It makes rational sense to then learn how to communicate in a more emotionally feasible way. But I now look at so many discussions online or on YouTube or in the cultural zeitgeist, and I can't help but put this simulation onto it. I just see it as, okay, that person there is talking from the heart, that person there is talking from the head. They both now hate each other because they're not listening to each other, and they're arguing from different foundations here. This is never going to get anywhere.
Yeah.
And, you can construct a whole sense of identity around certain ideas you have, and then if people are disagreeing with those ideas, that feels like a personal attack because you've made that identity enmeshed with your ideas. And yeah, I find it I'm so fascinated by it. I think it's just a really interesting way to view everything. And I do wonder, come back to what I said, I really do wonder if this kind of some people in their youth playing a lot of video games and some people being on social media a lot is just furthering the rift and dividing people even more.
Definitely. I think like a point I want to touch on as well before we wrap up is that we often talk about women and empathy and men and empathy, etc. And I feel like it's important to state just so that it's clear that almost everyone, actually has empathy. And I don't want men to listen to this being like, I'm a man, I have limited or less empathy. Some men have way more empathy than women, it's all spectrum, etc. And some people are more tended to lead with their empathy, but almost everyone has empathy. And empathy has like amazing influential power, like you've talked about on social media and a current affair and things like that. The movement that empathy takes, like all our massive movements for gay rights, black rights, all these things comes from a place often of empathy. And there's this one TikToker I follow, and his name is Jimmy Darts, and he goes around to people that may look like they could be like having a bad day or maybe in need, and he tries to get them to engage in like a game or something, like, hey, can you throw this ball with me? And if they engage with them, he gives them $500 cash or $1,000 cash. And they're often like have like this big emotional response, and they say like, I really needed this, I just lost my home, blah blah blah. And every single day he puts up a GoFundMe for that person, whoever he went to that day, and every single day there's like $100,000 of donations per day for one person. And it's like, logically you could think, well, there's a lot of homeless people in America, but they're sold on the story and they want to give their money to that specific person, and knowing like that person's their life is completely changed now. And this is because of one TikToker who is making himself famous via eliciting empathy for others. And he's doing amazing work, obviously, but it's really interesting to see like, he must at this point have had millions and millions of donations from people just being like, I really like that man in that one 30-second video. Let's change his life.
It's interesting because, yeah, that's you're absolutely right. There's nothing more powerful than a story that can connect with people's emotions. That's what a great film is. That's what a great any kind of story is. Another thing I thought was interesting was there was this YouTuber, he's definitely on the left side of things, who was talking about this other movement called effective altruism. Now, I think if you're in the veganism sphere, you might know about this, but basically effective altruism is about rationally ascertaining where your charitable donations will have the most impact. So you could give $20 to a homeless person in Australia, or that $20 could buy 10 malaria nets for people in Africa somewhere, and you're doing more good there. Now, this YouTuber was saying, well, just because something might have more effect, if you see a homeless person, you need to give that, you need to have that human connection with them. But then this was where I thought, okay, this is a perfect head versus heart conflict, because I think, no, actually, that then becomes more about you wanting to feel a sense of compassion by giving the money to the homeless person, when that $20 could do more good in the world by donating to, and this obviously isn't a perfect example because there'd be fees and whatever, and, how much is that $20 by the time it gets there? But to me, that's also an example of where heart thinkers could think a head thinker is lacking empathy and coming across as cold and unloving, when if I put myself in that position of being someone who'd be more inclined to do the effective altruism route, I would think that of the other person. I would think, well, actually, you're doing less good here, and I'm, by this systemizing measure, I'm actually, there's more good being done in the world. So, I think that's also another one where intentions come into it. The intention of both people would be good enough there where you shouldn't really, why criticize anyone there? But so interesting. And then not only that, then people can say, all right, well, to care about homeless people, you have to agree with the only when a political party comes out and says we care about homeless people, and here's an ad where we're showing you a homeless person and giving them a home and tugging at your emotions, whereas another party might say, well, we care about them too, but through this different policy or something. And then, who's actually doing more? The one that's appealing more to the emotions, or the one that's not necessarily appealing to the emotions, but may have a more substantial impact. And, I think if this podcast is probably articulating anything, it's that if you perceive yourself to be more of a head thinker or a heart thinker, think about that in itself and think about what the other person's motivations or needs might be in a given moment. And,
Yeah, because then you go down this whole other avenue as well as are we as humans truly altruistic, or are we selfish because people want to donate to people because it, like the homeless person on the street, because it might actually make them feel good or validate, or we know that when signing up or getting donations is way more effective when someone gets something in return, even if it's a rubber band that goes around your wrist. So it's this whole other element, well, if I donate online, I never even see where that goes. But if I give that $20 to someone in person, I will get that emotional, the feedback and the validation from that as well, and see the response and see where it goes. So that's a podcast for another day, I guess. It is,
yeah. We could probably go for hours on this. So,
yeah.
I think we'll end it there. And I really enjoyed that one. I hope you guys did too. And any final thoughts?
My brain hurts in a good way, but it does.
Yeah.
I need a nap.
Share this podcast if you enjoyed it. Let us know your thoughts if you're on YouTube watching this, and follow us on Instagram, on TikTok. Come to a comedy show, comedyuntamed.com. We've got shows in Sydney, Melbourne, Geelong, Brisbane and Newcastle. And Wagga Wagga, there's a show on in Wagga Wagga. Oh, actually, there's one last thing. I've been meaning to do this for a few podcasts, but a few weeks ago we did the waifuism episode, and someone just added some extra information about waifuism, which they thought, people might want to hear. So I'm going to read some of that email out. So we generally discuss people who fall in love with inanimate objects or concepts of a character, which is what waifuism, the sort of waifuism we were talking about. And they've said, but another part of waifuism, or perhaps a whole other culture sharing the name, of people who choose to adopt this same waifu energy that the people you discussed in the episode fall in love with. There's many tropes associated with waifu culture in general that people fall in love with or choose to adopt. For example, the DERE, Yandere, Tsundere, etc. Pronounced Yandere. Okay, I got that wrong. Sundare, for example. Waifuism is in fact a gendered culture. The femme form is, of course, waifu, based on the word wife. The masculine form is husbando. That's it. For some reason, I just think of Zorro or like Antonio Banderas when I hear husbando, which is naturally based on the word husband. Yeah, so, okay. Yeah. Surface level culture, where most people reside, claiming a character as your husbando or waifu just means that it was your favorite character from the source material, or the character you believe would be the most wife material if they were real. So just a bit of added information from that podcast we did a few weeks ago.
That's interesting as well, because I came across the husbandry stuff a lot online as well, but him saying it's just like wifey material, but when I'm on the waifuism subreddit, it is literally like I have had a ceremony to marry this person, and I've asked the creator of this animator if I have permission and consent, and this is how I consummate my marriage, this is how I make love to them, this is how we communicate, this is their favorite, I feel like there's obviously a lot of levels to it.
Yeah.
A lot of levels.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But yeah, very
Fascinating. So
interesting
fascinating.
subculture
And
there.
thank you. Yeah.
All right. Well, I think now we'll end that one. Hope you guys enjoyed it. And yeah, we'll see you next week. Share this podcast
next
if you
week.
can. And leave us a review. If you liked the podcast, that is. If you didn't, then just avoid doing that. And we'll see you next time. Bye, guys.
Bye.